I didn't come here to do the history of our museums, but I think it is important in a milestone event like this to situate our experience in Botswana as museum. Except that I don't think we're talking about museum. The proper title of this place is National Museum, Monuments, and Art Gallery. Now maybe the art gallery's been split administratively, I don't know. But monuments and art gallery. So it's about art, it's about museum, but it begins with monuments. And I think it's important to note that because I also think that's where we're moving forward right now, in at least one of the ways we're moving forward. And where did it begin? We did not begin our museum the way museums across the border, particularly in South Africa, began, or even in Zambia, Zimbabwe. We did not have colonial museum per se. But what we did have in the 1930s is two gentlemen, I have to say, gender or not, who got the ball rolling. Kosi Batwenwa-Bobedi, a Bangwaketsi, and a very unusual chap, which I could talk about, but I'll have to reserve him for another day, but Vivian Maiba Ellenberger, who at that time was a colonial official, but he was not a normal colonial official in the sense that his first language was Setswana. He was third generation here, born here, and all of that. Some of you might have seen his still important work on Baleti history, either in Setswana or English. It's still the touchstone. Anyway, what these two were concerned about and raised the red flag about was exactly what Professor Razul was talking about. The amount of artifacts, cultural heritage that was being taken out of the then Botswana Land Protectorate. And that resulted in two things which are still foundational. One was the passage of an act to begin to protect the monuments, which also meant to identify monuments, and legislation about not taking things away. Over time, these things became better enforced, but that began in that era with those two gentlemen. And it did, at least we would like to believe, help to arrest the situation. But by the time it had passed, unfortunately, quite a lot had been taken away, which why, yes, indeed, it is relevant for us to think about repatriation. But we can't think about repatriation if we don't know what was taken away. And some of that effort has to still come from us. The next step again fell on Kosi Batwen. You collect up, you protect documents, artifacts, and the likes. You should be displaying them. And Kosi Batwen on his own formed a community museum in Kanye. Not very professional per se, he did it on his own. Although he was a person who reached out to others. Professors like Professor Shapira and other people. Unfortunately, and then this is a recurring theme we've had, our first community museum had resource constraints. Just like every other community museum up to this day, including the one that I was one of the founders of in Mulipolole. But we have had that tradition of community museums. Then, when Batwen was having problems maintaining his museum, he and another figure, the late Alec Campbell, came along and, well, let's park some things here in Gaborone. And they got some support from others, including Masiri, in terms of political support, was always a very important pillar in all of these efforts from the 1960s. So the National Museum, which was then wedded to the monuments, was born in 1968 not as a government institution. It only became a government institution several years later. Mr. Campbell, for example, was working for government, but also the de facto curator of a museum that was a private project at first. Kosi Batwang was Kosi and then politician, and among the people working on this museum project. Then it became National Museum Monuments, an art gallery in the early 70s. So it's 71 or 72. Then, and I'm saying that because you see, we've had a direction that's a bit different. But we've also got, like I say, recurring themes of resource constraint and mobilization. But there was that era of Pitsi Naha going around. The museum, from at least a per capita basis, was very well known. The zebra branding was very well known. And it inspired other community efforts. You had Kosi Linswe and Sandy Grant and others starting the museum in Machudi. You had the Mulipululi people who co-opted me in Mulipululi with Kosi Sicheli Museum, Supangwao Museum, and others. The Dakar Museum among the Kwei, or Basaro as we say, in Dakar, and so forth and so forth. Again, then we had that 1983 report, diversification, etc. And what is still, again, not fully realized is a proper, sustainable relationship between the National Museum as the nexus point, as maybe the hub, and the community museums as the spokes, so to speak. You know, on the positive side, from that report, we did come together. We did involve a museum association. The district museums began to get some funding but sustainability, strategy, all sorts of things have been promoted over the years, but they have not been fully embraced. So, because the point I want to make is, to me, I don't see the National Museum as this set of buildings. It's never been that to me. At most, these buildings are the headquarters of the museums of Botswana. But when we look at Ditubarubwa Festival or Nama Festival or the likes, we know that the National Museum is a partner. We know that the monuments are being evolved, and we know that we are beginning, particularly in the last 10 years, to get more community mobilization, more community trusts and the likes working together. But at the same time, I would say, in terms of moving forward, we still don't have a sustainable way to promote this type of interrelationship, to prioritize, and the likes. Museums studies, I would certainly support it, but I think the first step is let's actually teach heritage and history in our schools. And as far as I'm concerned, we're not doing that. We make some little bit of a show, but the way we always bust this is, okay, yes, there's those 3 Dikosi in the CBD, and they're standing there representing what? If you ask the average person, they went to Britain to ask for protection, which is ridiculous. Because the protectorate, which wasn't protection, but a protectorate, was imposed in 1885 by a military force. Albeit there wasn't any fighting, the military force was more a show at that point. Dikosi went to Britain in 1895, 10 years later. They went there for a purpose. It's a very important history. But if we can't even get such a basic element, why did the Dikosi actually go to Britain? Who else went with them? Because they didn't go by themselves. There was other Botswana with them. What were they up to? What did they do? If we have a national monument, and yet we have such confusion about our core, our key, because certainly the Dikosi monument is our most important, at least in terms of public perception. If you were to say, what is the monument of Habaroni, it'd be Dikosi monument. And yet, we have it to the point now where people are so worried that when you look online, when you look in social media, not only is there debate about why they went, but some people no longer believe they did go. at all. They must have just stopped at Cape Town or something. So I think education, in other words, has been a big missing element. In the early years, it was one thing. Our curriculums were evolving. We were getting away from the Bantu education shadow and the likes. We did have the museum playing an active role in education, but that fell by the wayside. The momentum went out. Social studies somehow kind of crushed this thing. And history was just dropped altogether. It was supposedly merged in social studies, but even civics, as far as I'm concerned, was lost. And I say that because, again, when we talk about our government, half the time I think people are talking about somebody else's government, because they're talking about political concepts that aren't our constitution, they're somebody else's constitution. Be that as it may. I don't have all day, but other ways to move forward. First of all, I endorse everything pretty much that has been said, whether it's about gender, about repatriation, about the 21st century, about challenging privilege, about reinvigorating our independence, because this museum has actually had a fair amount of independence. Its biggest problem, though, is it's still a government department. And as a government department, it is constrained more, I would tell you, being in government, by the sheer mechanics of procurement, of professional, typology, or whatever you're calling. This is a D3 position. This is a this. This is that. The system of government, as it exists now, is not very conducive to professional development, and that's true in museums, just like media or education. So yes, corporatize the museum monuments could be a way, and in that way, it might be the way to also bring more harmony, to reboot the relationship between the National Museum and the other museums, to make it a little more clearer. The second part to me is digitization. That goes not just in social media, but yes, the museum of today, I think it has to be interactive. It has to be pulling things. In as much as we may get some artifacts, there are some things which maybe we won't get, but we can get, because after all, in a digital, virtual world, there's lots of things that can be here or there, whether it comes physically here or it stays physically there. To be honest, the Mafeking Museum has done us a great favor by protecting Seychelle's cannon, even though for a while they didn't know it was Seychelle's cannon. They protected it because it was part of their history, the Mafeking siege. But there it is. And, whether it comes here or it stays there, I think the most important thing is that we know about it, our children can see it, and then they can understand what it's about. A lot of our monuments, it's the same thing. Dimawe's been protected, not without a fight, but there's no signage there to this day. There's nothing to explain why Dimawe's important in anything. I'm going to look again at my Nama friends here. We recently had Simon Cooper's grave turned into a more proper, monument, that is, a proper headstone and what about him. But there's so much more to be done, because that site is so important. Here we have Lahwabe as the place where the Nama Simon Cooper finally stood down, but a war that had been going on for many years that brought down German governments, that created so much situations that, was a model of a guerrilla struggle, and in the case of Simon Cooper, an undefeated liberation leader, which again brings us into the situation which our history is changing, not only as we discover it, but as we interact with the changing histories of Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the likes as well. And that's very clear on another community project whose relationship to this museum is, again, anomalous. Fish Kitsing's house in Peleng, which was not only the safe house of the ANC in the 1960s, but the place where the first Congress of the African National Congress in exile took place. The place where the Umkhonto we Sizwe was not formed but ratified, where the external wing of the ANC was ratified, where for the first time after Sharpeville, internal and external came together. And so yes, our history is not just our history. We're holding history of Namibia here, we're holding history of Zimbabwe freedom struggle here, and South African freedom struggle in particular.